Hello guys, 1 week ago I released a beginner's guide to Imperator Rome and I asked you guys, what other guides would you like to see? What would help you? And one of the suggestions I got was to make a guide on the different building types and go over their usefulness across different nations in the game and across the game time of the game. So let's start with this. There are different building types, but they're built in different places. And there's 3 different places you can build a building. 2 of them are identical. There is a city, like we see here, the city of Lavinium in Latium. There's a metropolis, which is Rome here. A metropolis is the highest level of settlement. This is upgraded directly from a city, and a city is upgraded directly from a settlement. Now, that hierarchy of settlement up to city up to metropolis doesn't necessarily always mean better things. If you want access to city buildings, you get them at city. You don't need a metropolis to get access to any specific buildings. A metropolis, realistically, is just a bigger version of a city with slightly different bonuses. You can see here, this is the bonuses that come from having a city. And then you'll notice things like the local city building slots and the population capacity go up dramatically when we look at a metropolis. There are changes like this. The only other difference really that would be beneficial to you in terms of buildings, and this isn't something you'll see under possible buildings, is actually for these temples. If you go over to your religion, to your holy sites get their max bonus if in a metropolis. That is the only kind of building that will ever directly benefit from building all the way up, which means we only really need to examine cities and settlements themselves. So let's go over that. Let's start with settlements because look how much easier it is to look at a settlement. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different buildings that you can build in a settlement. There is a fortress. This can be built in a settlement or a city, in fact. However, a settlement can only build 1 building at all without a special technology. Cities and above have multiple building slots, meaning you can build multiple fortresses in a city. However, a fortress in a settlement, if you build one there, it's all you're building there. So you better make sure you don't want anything else that you can build there before you can build it. When building fortresses, however, you'll have to keep in mind throughout your entire region that you're in that there are limited slots. For example, the first fort that you put in any territory in a region, this consumes 3 points, and the default is 5. So if I were to build a settlement fortress, that's 3 of those 5 points. Meaning, if I built a fortress anywhere else, we'd hit 6 points, which means every point above the capacity that I go, I have to pay more maintenance. It becomes harder to maintain. However, if you look at a city, and you're building a fortress, the first one consumes 3, but everyone after that only consumes 1 of the total fort infrastructure capacity. So if I build one in, for example, Rome, like I have here, that's 3 points. Build a second one there, and then that's another point, only 1 more point. So I can build up, by default, 3 levels of fort in 1 city without being penalized, but then that's all we will have for fort infrastructure in the entire region. So when building forts, you want to think, well, do I want to have a really fortified city? Then there's other things that can help that we'll go over later. Or if you don't even have any cities available, what settlement would be most beneficial to fortify? You can increase fort infrastructure capacity if you'd rather spread these smaller forts around, or you can just build it up even higher. The main benefit to forts is actually the fort level itself, which it doesn't really explain very well in these modifiers, but the fort will dramatically help you if you're defending a territory. For example, regardless of if it's on a city or if it's on a settlement, if your capital is fortified, then an enemy cannot simply walk up and then take it over within the span of a month. They're gonna have to besiege it. And how well or not well they do that depends on a mixture of your fort level, your fort funding, which you can find in economy, your fort maintenance. More maintenance means more garrison personnel and more fort defense. Less funding means that these things are lowered. And then also the composition of the enemy army matters. So it's really up to you how you use it, but those are your options. Next, in settlements, we have a barracks. A barracks is exclusive to a settlement. As you see, fortresses are shared between these two positions, but I believe everything else, with the exception actually of a port, is going to be exclusive. So fort and port, those go everywhere that exists that can service them. Ports can only go on the coast, but basically in a city or a settlement you can build a fort or a port, but everything to the right of that here is exclusive. Additionally, while a port or fort do not have these limitations, you are limited to only one of these settlement exclusive buildings, even if you do get the technology that allows you to have 2 slots in a settlement. But a barracks is primarily here for getting manpower. It's something we'll notice as well across every settlement exclusive, most of them. Buildings also is that you will lose migration speed. So if you want population to natively move to a place, one of the worst things you can actually do in a settlement is build a building that specializes that settlement, with the exception of the fort, the port, and the provincial legation. But looking at the barracks, see, pop migration speed goes down by 1/4. But you get a lot more manpower, which is this resource up here that you use to build into your legions, to replenish your levies, things like that. If you need manpower and you have enough pops to make use of it in a certain settlement, then a barracks is a great thing to build to expand that. Your usage and how useful it is to you depends on how much you rely on levies and legions and how well you keep up with your manpower. There's other solutions to that, not just building barracks, but also there's using mercenaries. It's really your preference, but this is really good for that. Additionally, since you are getting this settlement set up for manpower for your military, that would mean that this wouldn't be a very slave-heavy place, and this reflects in what happens next. Your desired ratio of pops goes up to an additional 15%, leaning towards freemen. And freemen generally become happier because, you know, they'll have stuff to do. If we view the pops, you can always check your desired ratios down here. It's always going to favor slaves in these territories because they're working, they're making you money. The economy in this point in history relies heavily on slaves, unless you're a barbarian nation, in which case you'll probably have a lot of tribesmen here. Instead, this is your main pop. If you're not a barbarian, you probably won't have any tribesmen. And then freemen are the highest level that someone can achieve without becoming an actual integrated pop in your nation. And so these, as we can see by their bonuses, they will give manpower and taxes, not just taxes. They will give far less in taxes because they're not as productive to that, but they will give more manpower. So not only are you increasing your percentage of local manpower, the modifier, but you're going to increase the desired ratio of the population that gives you manpower. So again, this is just really, really good for building up your manpower if that's what you need to sustain your legions or levies. Next, we have the mine. This is a resource building. There's a couple of these, and I can't build a mine anywhere over here if I wanted to, but generally looking around mountains is a good place to find somewhere that I can, like right here. We have iron. You need some sort of mineral to be extracted to build a mine. Without this present, you cannot build a mine. A mine, as well as a barracks, makes it harder for population to migrate here naturally. Because also, anyway, the main thing you're going to need here are slaves. But you can always manually move slaves there using the move pops if you need to get the economy of this territory off the ground. This will reduce the amount of slaves needed for local surplus. And one thing that almost every one of these buildings has in common, you could look for it right here, it'll also increase your civilization level by a little bit if that's important to you. The values are usually not very high in that regard, but I believe some might find it useful, and this is one of the only benefits that a mine has. The main primary benefit is about increasing the production of whatever mineral is located here, and you do that by lowering the amount of slaves that you even need to go there to begin with. You can achieve the same thing if you have not enough population by simply moving more slaves here. The next building over is the tribal settlement. Now this one's really only useful for barbarians. It increases your population capacity by 10%, which is really, really cool. It lowers the citizen desired ratio, and it crazily buffs up the output and happiness of tribesmen. As we can see, it's not going to buff up their desired ratio, it's just going to make less citizens want to be here due to the presence of a tribal settlement. It's going to buff up tribesmen. The pop cap is decent because that could allow you to get more slaves here for production, but you really would be better off just building a mine if there's a mineral, or other buildings in other cases that we will get to as we go through this list. But basically, if you're not a barbarian, you won't benefit very much from this other than the pop capacity, and I'm not quite sure why you would want that, actually, in a settlement. You'd rather just get one of the dedicated resource buildings, I would think. Next up are ports, and as I mentioned, ports can only be built on places that border the ocean. The sea is the sea, or the ocean. Not rivers, only the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea, things like that. These grant a +1 to pop capacity, and this also is the case if you look at it in a city. The benefits are pretty much exactly the same. The migration attraction will go up. This is quite opposite to losing 25% pop migration speed. You know, it will have a kind of opposite effect because you get more speed, not quite the same, it's not percentage based, but you'll also get more migration attraction. So if I build a port right here, pops will want to move there more, and I'm more likely to get more of whatever is desired here moving there without me spending anything to forcibly move things here. Additionally, you get a bonus to ship recruit speed. This only really matters if you're building it in a city, because if you're in a settlement, then you need to build one of these ports to begin building ships anyway. Therefore, that ship recruit speed bonus is kind of just your base recruitment time, and then the extra pop cap if that's what you want. This is very good for making your coasts more attractive to have anyone move into, as people can move in from coasts, which can do well to boost migration from other nations depending on your situation. This is a save I booted up from a PvP, so we don't really have any neighbors, but migration attraction is always good for getting people to move from your own nation. For example, even if you have a lot of mines deeper in a province and you want more slaves to be there, well, you can have more people move in by lining the coast with ports and then having mines behind that, and then you essentially can shift those workers. That's a way that you can use a port. Otherwise, it's mainly just good for building ships. Personally, I prefer to build ports in my cities more than anything else. I don't really like building ports anywhere else. Every port you have is a place that pirates can raid, is something to keep in mind. And a port in a settlement is only going to be able to build the smallest of ships, whereas in cities you can keep stacking them like you can with forts without any big limitations like fort infrastructure. So if you build this all the way up to 5 and you have everything else that you need, you could build the biggest ships. And that's where a metropolis comes in handy if it's on the ocean, is you get more building slots to build up more ports. Because if we built 5 here, that's almost everything we can build here, and that's pretty crazy. However, that's also when you can just simply take certain cities and say, this is going to be a fleet building city. I believe I did that right here. Yeah, this city is a fleet building city. It has level 5 ports. You get more building slots in cities, in case you're wondering, just by having population there. You can see the math here. At least 1 building, and 1 for every 10 pops that you add in, plus bonuses based on whether or not you're a city, whether or not you're a metropolis. And just as there is a tech to allow you to build more in a settlement, there are techs to boost your building slots in cities as well. And permanent modifiers that can affect it as well, such as up here, make religious endowments. This will add a permanent building slot to every city that you have in a province. Only that province, and only cities, not settlements, regardless of what you might have researched. Moving on to the next building in the list in settlements, we have slave estates. You got your civilization level bonus like some other buildings, your population migration speed debuff like some other buildings, but you also have a 50% increase to local monthly food modifier and a 30% increase to local slave output. Now here's where this is really, really good. For example, when building timber, if you have grain, you don't want a slave estate usually, you want a farm, and I'll talk about that when we get to farms. If you have mines, you'd rather have a mine because really there, probably, it's all about the resource, because it's not as common as something like timber, etc., other resources that don't have special buildings, where you might care more about trading the resource. This will produce more food, the same amount of additional food as a farm, I might add, although there's a caveat there that we'll go over, and increases local slave output, which is going to increase your money. So this is what you pick if you want slave output for money instead of the actual resource there. And it's a great choice for getting more food in places where you don't already have a food resource, because these territories, these settlements always, usually, are generating food for the cities and any metropolises. You can only have one metropolis, by the way, per province, but as many cities as you want. This is usually where you get the food to support those cities, is the surrounding settlements. Slave estates can increase it, and I would recommend, as I mentioned, building them anywhere that you don't want to port for whatever reason, that you can't build a mine, and that you cannot build a farm. In my eyes, it's just the perfect final building after you go through that checklist of this would give me the most benefits at this point. Leaving out specialties and resources, this is probably the most useful building that you can put on a settlement out of all of them, if you ask me. Now moving on to farms. Farms are like mines. They require certain resources, for example, like grain or fish if you have access to it. You cannot build it here where there's wood or here where there's cloth. This is a good place to build slave estates. Farms do the same thing as mines, to a T, like the exact same thing as mines, but with food resources. But they have the additional benefit of also generating extra food, the same amount of extra food as a slave estate, but they do not grant the extra 30% to slave output, so you will not get as much money from it. However, you make this back from the less slaves needed in order to produce additional resources, because food resources generate food within themselves. Probably more valuably, because you can also export this stuff and use it to move around, shuffle around your own kingdom using trade routes, or just, for this one specific place that you are, in order to make money, as well as try to fill in any food shortages anywhere else. You can't just take food in a reserve and move it anywhere else, but you can take additional grain being produced and send that to another part of your kingdom by going to another part of your kingdom, doing import, and then if you didn't have full trade routes, which I guess I could just show you what that looks like. You could go, for example, click on grain, and look at this. Look at all this extra grain that I have. This is very late game. I can also import it from someone else, and usually that's preferable, but less reliable, because they could always break the trade route, whereas your own trade and your own resources are likely to maintain themselves unless you intentionally fuck them up somehow. Now we have the final kind of building that you can build exclusively in a settlement, and in a settlement in general, is the provincial legation. This greatly buffs up your population migration. This encourages the speed. It doesn't encourage people to move here. It just encourages the speed to go a little bit faster, or a lot of bit faster, 75% faster, in fact. So a port is probably better to get someone there to begin with, but if you want people to get here faster, provincial legation is the way to go. That's not its main bonus, however. Its main bonus is actually the pop assimilation speed. Due to a playstyle preference you might have for assimilating cultures that you conquer or that move to your country, for example, that you encourage by using ports or other things like that. They cannot join your military. They cannot fight in your military. They can only exist in your economy and generate resources and money. You might want them, for reasons that I'll go over when I do a culture guide, to become your primary culture. Pop assimilation speed bonuses, like you have here, will speed that up. So if you want to use a settlement, this is better if you don't already have cities, quite honestly. But if you want to use a settlement for this, then a provincial legation is great. Or if you just take over a swath of new territory, for example, if I took over, let's say Gaul right now, which is full of Arverni, and I wanted to very quickly convert as many of them as possible, well, the best thing I could do, other than making cities that can do this, and I'll show you kind of how that works later, the best thing I could do is actually just go around where they have a bunch of slaves already, just spread around in their settlements, and then build provincial legations to go on a massive conversion spree. There's other ways to assimilate, mind you. This is not necessarily the most efficient way, but we're going over buildings today, not culture management. And so that is everything that is exclusive to settlements. And we've already kind of gone over forts and ports in general and how they relate to cities. Now we have the rest of this. But as a general recap, if you have minerals, I would build a mine. If you have food, I would build a farm. If you have anything else, I would build a slave estate. Unless for whatever reason you want a port or you're trying to massively assimilate a population, provincial legation. If you're a barbarian, then tribal settlements are actually just really, really worth it. And you might want to compare that to your other options. Barbarians are usually a more early game thing though. You won't really have barbarian status in the long run. I've never seen a barbarian player that did not convert to something more civilized later on. And forts, I would only build a fort in a settlement if it was my capital and there wasn't any other city in the province. Otherwise, I would just move my capital to that city and build a fort there, is what I would do. The reason being is that, forts, you could build them up more, way more easily if you simply put it in a city. And a fort can keep control over things around it pretty decently with a zone of control. So basically, if an enemy tried to come down here, they literally couldn't because this fort would be blocking their movement. They would have to capture from like each side first these cities and then proceed through them like that. But if they leave, the zone of control from the fort would actually recapture everything around this settlement, the city, for me as a natural thing. So they'd have to always maintain someone here to keep it without actually capturing the zone of control source, aka my forts. In settlements, buildings always have a pretty specific purpose. There's rarely anything that's super general, and even if it's super general, it's usually the obvious choice, slave estate, for example. Or if you're a barbarian, then it's tribal settlements. In cities, everything is like super hyper focused on what you do with it. For example, an aqueduct. This is another building that you can stack. Every one that you build adds 4 population capacity. This is good if you want more population here for whatever reason. For example, in a city, it means I can fit more nobles. It means I can fit more citizens. And thus I can get more research because that's what these pops pump out. As well as some manpower. Whatever I really set through buildings and other things, my desired ratios of pops here to be, I will get more of them. Anything above your total limit will move out or start starving if they get too high up. Aqueducts are especially useful if you're trying to turn a city into a metropolis, because you'll need to meet a very specific thing here. If you wish to do that, you need a population of 80 or greater to even make a metropolis, and then that will give you population capacity by itself. And then the rest is really up to you. Once I have a metropolis, I don't personally see the value to aqueducts. I'd rather just spread my population out more. But there is something to be said about simply getting more population once you have other bonuses, for being very specific with what you produce somewhere. For example, going full nobles for a bunch of research. That is a strategy. It's not a strategy I would use, but it's a perfectly understandable strategy that I'm sure someone out there uses. Next up, we have a granary. This is as simple as a little bit of civilization to your total, as well as getting some food capacity. So this number right here is the amount of food that we can store. So especially useful in places where you're not always very good on food. You can store extra food in case something goes wrong, in case you don't trust that income. Personally, I never build these. I don't see the point of storing. I'm all about maintaining simply a surplus of income instead of a deficit. And I've never personally had a granary help me. So I would personally never recommend using granaries, but there are use cases where maybe based on the time of year, winter or otherwise, your food production might change or something. And then that's why it'll go back and forth. But usually you'll be very set in I'm making enough food or I'm not making enough food. And I don't think any amount of granary will help that, because you cannot, as I pointed out, you cannot directly import food. You can just import resources like grain, which affects your income of food. So granary, this is what it does. and I don't really recommend it. Next up, we have a library. This helps produce extra research points as a base modifier. Gives you that extra little bit of civilization, and gives you a little tiny bonus on converting population. Libraries and granaries, by the way, are stackable, and you could just build a ton of them if you want. This is very good if you want to specifically get more research points, but there's other ways to accomplish this in cities as well that are limited. This is more unlimited. So that's what this does. It's very simple. Marketplaces, civilization bonus. Additionally, pop assimilation speed. This big thing that we saw, we could get a 15% bonus of in a settlement. We get 2.5 per marketplace that we build here. This is a way to do it. It can also help you get more trade routes, these little bonuses. This is stackable, but also not the most efficient way to do this in a city. I'd save literally every building from aqueduct all the way to tax office up here that I am showing you. I would save all of these for once the bottom buildings are done. Once you have decided which ones of these you want to build and have built them. And we'll get to why later, but generally it's because the bonuses up here are smaller. And they're, again, unlimited, whereas everything down here is bigger bonuses, but they're limited. That's what a marketplace does. And again, I wouldn't really recommend doing it until you've done some other things down below. Then we have training camps. This is just like a barracks out and about, but it doesn't give you more freemen. It just gives you 10%. Ignore this is because I have 2. 10% local manpower per training camp that you build. They are stackable. 2% civilization per one that you build. Same thing as the other things beside it. The tax office, 10% additional local tax per level that you build, plus the 2% civilization bonus. Again, for training camps, I'd say build this if you really need manpower, and you know, this is something you could fit in there, then it'd be good. But again, I would really prioritize everything down here, unless this is really, really necessary to you, you know? And then tax offices, if you really need more money. If you're anything like me, you will end up not relying on tax income anyway. Look at my income. We get 153.5 from taxes and almost 300 from commerce. If you're playing anything like me, taxes are not going to be your biggest source of income, and thus I don't think this is actually a very important building at all. But if you do need the extra money and you're happy with the other buildings that you have here, this is a way to get some more. Next up, we have the earthworks. You can only build one of these in any given territory, so that's per city. You cannot build these in a settlement, of course. These are crazy, these things. They will lower your population capacity for that city, so never build this in a metropolis, or if you do, wait until it's a metropolis before you build it. It will vastly buff up your local fort defense, more than even your forts do. It just won't change your fort level. It's a very amazing modifier to fort defense. It will add hostile attrition, so hostiles here will lose men to attrition faster just by default. And combat width will be reduced, so bringing a bigger army here to besiege this location actually won't help you nearly as much, because you won't be able to fit as many of them through the infrastructure that the earthworks sets up. This is perfect if you want to make a fortified city that is a point that you are not supposed to get through, like in some sort of mountain pass, and let's say it's the only way through. This is an amazing building for making that place nigh impossible to push through. You do have to research it though, you don't have this by default, but for a fortified military town based around fortifications and maybe training camps, this is a invaluable building that you should not skip on. Next up, we have the foundry. This is another thing that you can only build one of, and you must research this as well. It'll tell you what to research, by the way. The foundry buffs up your local tax a lot more than a tax office. 2.5 times more, in fact. And again, you can only build one of them. It also buffs up the amount of research points that you get by default here. 2.5 times more. Actually, hold up. No, that's not even true. 5 times more than a library does. That's a big fucking difference. Gives 5% civilization level instead of 2, and lowers the amount of slaves needed for a local surplus by 4. So this is amazing for generating money, research, civilization, and resources all at once. And you can only build one. I don't know why you would not build one of these. There's like no downsides to this other than the fact that it takes up a slot. This is the first building in this list that I can say this for, and it's probably the only one that I can say this for. Not building this, in my opinion, is silly. Every city that you have, in my opinion, should get this foundry. Early game if you have it, mid game definitely, and late game still, of course. I don't really understand why anyone wouldn't make it. Next we have the Great Temple. This is another thing you need to unlock. You can only build one of these in any given territory. It adds provincial loyalty. This is really important for maintaining unhappy pops due to culture or whatever. It will just simply add loyalty regardless of the situation of happiness in the region. And it will just simply make everybody here happier if they follow your religion. Even if they don't all follow your religion, those that follow your state religion will become happier. You get that 5% civilization bonus for one building slot, and a conversion speed increase to converting populations that are not your religion to your religion to then get that happiness bonus. So if you have a lot of populations here, for example, that are not Hellenic, which is what we are, and you want them to convert passively over time, this is a good way to do it. One building, an increase to it, and then everybody else that's your own population's happier. This is another it's a good thing to build even if you have everyone converted, because it will make them all happier, which will make loyalty less of an issue, but still gives you loyalty even then. It's a great thing for keeping order. Speaking of keeping order, that leads me to the next building, the Grand Theater, and I think this does what I just described for the temple, but even better. It does it on the front of culture instead of religion, and I find this to be so much more impactful. So for one building slot, and you must unlock this through tech, you get an increase to your territory loyalty, just passively, your integrated cultures, all of them, no matter how many you integrate, 1, 6, you name it, they are all happier. And this is very important, by the way, if you're integrating a lot of cultures, because every additional one you integrate will make all the other ones less happy. This will get their happiness back up. And will also make happier anyone that assimilates, which is good because this buffs your assimilation. And it's a pretty decent buff. And so I build one of these in basically every single city. But also, I especially try to build them in every new city that I conquer, because it will get the culture assimilating. And personally, I find that culture is way bigger of a challenge of dealing with than religion for keeping people happy, because the religion part is more in the background, it's more passive, there's no active ways to go around changing someone's religion, whereas there's a lot of ways to actively try to change someone's culture, and there's a lot of pushback when you try to do it. So this is a great passive way to do it, while also maintaining order in a city. Personally, these two buildings right here are my #1 go-tos. Every time I get a new city, I try to build these and the foundry first. I find these to be the most important buildings. There are very little downsides to either. The foundry just is great all around. The temple can be kind of useless if you don't need extra happiness and everyone's already your religion anyway. The Grand Theater, I would never want to live without. It's just that much more useful than the Great Temple. But these three, in my opinion, are the most important buildings you can build in any city, short of building a fort to protect your city capital of your province. The next 4 buildings all have to do with the main 4 pop types that you'll find in a city. I say main 4 because we're excluding tribesmen, because tribesmen are never really going to live in a city. That goes against their whole thing. These are the barbarian pop, the one unified barbarian pop. These boost those pretty much from left to right, just as you would expect. An academy boosts up nobles. It increases their desired ratio by 5% per one that you build. You can only build 3. You do not need to unlock these buildings. It adds to monthly civilization change, like increase to the cap set by the level bonuses we've been going over. And it makes all the nobles living here happier. This is an amazing trio of buildings to build if you want to specialize in having nobles pump out research for you. Then, the Court of Law. It adds to provincial loyalty, much smaller of an amount than the Grand Theater, but you can build 3 of them. It increases citizen happiness and desired ratio, gives you some civilization level bonus, no change to that, however. And citizens pump out, as we know, research to a lesser extent to nobles, and some manpower. And then forums, these allow you to have more freemen, who, as we know, build manpower, and they also give you some money. It also gives you a very small amount of extra food, makes the freemen living there happier, and civilization level. If you're having food problems, it can definitely be worth looking into these just for that extra little bonus. Just as if you're having loyalty problems, building the courts of law could be worth looking into for that extra little bonus. However, I'd like to point this out real quick. Forums and courts of law, and also even mills, these all boost their respective desired ratios for their populations by 10% each. It's only 5% each for the academy boosting nobles. So if you want a research focus, you're going to have to simply not build these other three and just simply and only boost up the nobles with the academy. Maybe you could get away with also boosting up citizens because they also produce research, and you'd just simply be lowering the amount of freemen and slaves. Your strategy there is really up to you. But from left to right, you know, academy and court of law, most important if you want research. Court of law, better if you want manpower, because you'll still get some manpower from citizens, but nobles will never serve in the military, so they generate no manpower, just a fuck ton of research. If worrying about research isn't a big deal, and especially if you're having food problems, that is where the forum comes in, because you get some extra freemen, which just give you a little bit of money, just give you a little bit of manpower, and give you more food. So it's good if you don't care about the research. Then mills. It increases the desired ratio of slaves, which goes hand in hand with, up here we had something that was boosting or lowering the amount of slaves you need. Oh yeah, right here, the foundry. The foundry pairs really well with this because then you have more slaves. The slaves output more, so it's more money. You can build 3 of these as well. The slaves are happier, so they're less likely to cause problems and lower your loyalty in a region. The mill is a great thing to do if you're trying to build a slave city, as I call it. A city that prioritizes slaves, has other things as well, but prioritizes also building up slaves to still produce a fuck ton of whatever resource it is on, potentially more than a settlement ever could, by the way, if you get enough slaves there and pair it with a foundry. I mean, look, we have 3 of this producing and we only have 9 slaves. Now imagine if we increased the amount of slaves and got a foundry here. Well, there you go. That's just a perfect pair. But you see, these 4 buildings here, despite their usefulness, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you build all of them. First off, that's 12 building slots. That's a lot. That's almost everything, like 12, 13, 14, 15, and then like 16 if there's a military place, right? That's all my building slots in my metropolis of Rome, right? That's crazy. We can hardly expect to meet that as a norm. If you don't care what pops you have, but you want the max amount of bonuses, then building each of these is actually definitely worth it. But ideally, you'll be specializing your cities, and then you'll want to pick what you have. For research, lean more to nobles, citizens if you need to go any further. Otherwise, for production of money and resources, you want slaves. You can get some manpower, money from freemen, as well as a teeny bit more food if that's what you want. I can't really recommend what your strategy would be there. I could just tell you what strategies that they would fit. And then I mentioned holy sites at the beginning, and you can build holy sites. I guess that's kind of a building by coming over to any place that doesn't have one and dedicating a holy site with this button. It costs money, it costs political influence. They give very good bonuses, as you can see. Again, I would recommend only building those in places that you plan on reaching a metropolis so you get the max possible bonus, as well as the max amount of relics that you could put inside of them. And then there's great wonders as well. You can't build these unless you have an event that prompts you to build one. You can, however, destroy them. I don't know why you would want to destroy them, but you can do it. Generally, I would recommend not destroying these because they give you generally amazing bonuses, and I've never found one that made me want to destroy it. The only reason I would ever destroy one of these is if I had taken this over. For example, let's say I'm Carthage, right? And I take Rome, and I know I can't hold it, and Rome's gonna kick my ass after this, right? I'm gonna destroy this because fuck you, Rome. I don't want you to have this at max tier with max bonuses, so I'm just gonna tear it down then. That might be a reason, but yeah, not very easy to build and not usually very advantageous to tear down. But with that, we have our entire guide. That is what every single building in the game does, even kind of leaving this screen and looking at great wonders and holy sites and whatnot. I I hope you found this helpful. If you have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below, especially if you think that they would make a good guide. I love this game, so you can expect more Imperator Rome guides incoming. For now, though, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.